Hello everyone. Hope everybody's having a good start of your week and that things are going well. This week our conversation moves to some discussion about the article by Laura Atkins, and it's the one called "What's the Story? Reflections on White Privilege in the Publication of Children's Books." A couple of introductory comments. First of all, remember that in these first 2 weeks of our term, just partly to give you lead time to find and acquire actual children's books that we will start discussing next week, I'm using the first 2 weeks to lay some groundwork by having you read a couple of articles and give you some things to think about and to talk about before we actually get into some discussion of actual children's books. So this is the second week of that lead time. Last week we looked at the Deborah Thompson article about teachers' knowledge and awareness of multicultural books, and this week we look at the paper here by Laura Atkins about white privilege in children's books and children's book publishing. I might point out that what you have before you is an actual, what we call a paper. It's the text of an address, a speech in essence, if you will, or such, that a lecture would be a better term, that Atkins actually delivered at a professional conference. I don't know if she's actually published this in a journal or such, but we do refer to this as a paper. It's an essay, it's an address, it's a lecture that she delivered at a professional conference a couple of years ago. So let me give you a couple of things to think about. I'll point out a few topics from the article, and then I'll toss this open for your discussion and your commenting throughout the week. On the second page, and the pages are not really numbered, but if you notice, on the second page of the article, she talks about how our own expectations set the stage for how we react to children's books, especially multicultural books. And she says, "I became aware over time of how my reaction to manuscripts as an editor was based on my background, class, race, education, and gender. I had certain expectations of the types of stories that were appropriate for children, ways of constructing a narrative, and content that was child-friendly." As a thread that runs through this article, and as the thread that runs through our thinking, remember something that I believe I pointed out earlier. Teaching is overwhelmingly a white middle-class profession. Well over 90% of all teachers are like us, or at least like many of us, white, middle class, obviously college educated. And yet 90% of our students are not of that particular background. So think a little bit about ourselves. How does our background set us up to expect what's appropriate for children and what's appropriate content that is child friendly? And that carries through the book here, or through the article. Another comment that Atkins makes very soon after that is related to the market for children's books. And this is interesting to think about. When adult books are published, books aimed at an adult audience, Stephen King, for example, with mystery stories, or similar kinds of popular authors, the publishers know very clearly who their market is and who they're targeting. But who are we really targeting as the market in children's publishing? Who really buys children's books? Certainly parents do to some degree. Children do to some small degree, largely through school book orders, but even then, it's sort of the parents purchasing them through the kids, or at least parents having influence over the choice. But what about teachers, and what about librarians? So if the book is appealing to a certain type of audience, what's the marketability related to who's actually going to buy that book? And Atkins gives us some comments down here. Towards the bottom of the third page, she says, "I would argue that most children's publishing houses currently exist in order to serve the interests and needs of the white majority culture." Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that that's a legitimate concern, or is that not? Moving over several pages farther on, a couple of things that caught my eye. She talks about later, this is about page 6 or 7, she talks about a similar situation here where an author of a children's book Deshaun Days, and the author of that book, believed that children living in their environment actually need to see the reality represented accurately, and that white children who do not come from this experience should not be overly protected from the realities of the world. How much should we protect kids from the realities of the world? How much should we expose kids to the reality of the world? One of the things that caused me to think about this is she comments about the mainstream publishing houses, the really big name publishers, Random House, things of that kind. And again, it goes back to the issue of marketing. Where are the books actually going to be sold? Large, big chain bookstores, small independent bookstores in small towns? Who's most likely to go in and buy those books? Who's most likely to become aware of those books? Think about if you walk into any of these big, large chains, what kinds of children's books do you see prominently displayed and prominently marketed? And who do you see around you in the store purchasing those books, or at least browsing through those books? At the bottom of this one particular page here, she says, this was a small multicultural publishing house that published this book, so imagine how this might take place in large publishers which have less overt concern about the diversity and representation in the books that they publish. Do you think that's a fair criticism of the big publishing houses? And then finally, just a couple of comments here, and I'm going to turn it loose back to all of you again. She talks about what it's like being an editor and how the editor influences those choices. I'm reminded of a comment that I heard from a well-published and well-known children's author that is here in Oregon, where he happens to live in Portland. I won't mention his name because I don't know if it would be appropriate to mention secondhand what he said. But in a conference, I heard him talk about authors and what it's like being an author. And somebody asked, how does one get to be an actual children's book editor? And he said, well, the first thing is you generally start in the publishing industry as an intern. And interns, as we know, are paid very, very little for their internships in whatever industry it happens to be. And he said, think about this. The publishing houses overwhelmingly tend to be located in New York City, Manhattan to be precise. Many of the interns in the big New York City, Manhattan-based publishing companies tend to come from elite, upper class, or well-to-do families, and they are graduates of well-to-do, rather elite, selective universities on the East Coast. Their families, in essence, can help subsidize the extremely expensive cost of living in Manhattan. And you have to live in Manhattan if you want to be in the publishing industry, because that's where the action is, or at least in New York City. So it automatically slants the editorship in a certain direction. That's an interesting comment to think about. Who tends to become the editors and who tends to move into that profession? So I invite you to read through the Atkins article, take a look at some of the comments. Some of them you may agree with, some of them you may disagree with. Some of them you may think about in the context of children's books that you've seen in your schools. Talk about those, okay? What do you see in the article? How does it color your vision? How does it influence what you bring to a children's book with a multicultural character or multicultural theme? Appropriateness, content, marketability, any of those kinds of factors. Okay? I'll throw it open for discussion on the discussion board. Take care, everybody.